Welcome to the Calm Analytics channel. I'm Borys Tizengauzen. Today is November 20th, and there are a lot of important news stories. So, in this episode, the 28 points of the Russian plan that were brought to Ukraine. What's in there? How did Witkoff and Dmitriev secretly write the document without the participation of Ukraine and Europe? And the details: recognition of Donbas as Russian, or renting Donbas for money by Russians. What other points did the American delegation bring? So how is it? Qatar and Turkey are also involved in the deal. The agreement even includes a personal condition for Putin. For the first time, Russia is starting to sell off its gold, and the YouTube killer is already on the way. This isn't the only topic in today's episode. There will be plenty of other news as well. So if you're new to this channel, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And now, some interesting details are starting to surface regarding the Witkoff-Dmitriev plan, which is being proposed for Ukraine to accept. Today, we'll try to figure out what this is all about and how it came to be. And there's a lot of interesting stuff there. So it turns out that for several weeks now, Trump's special representative for Russia, Steve Witkoff, and Putin's special representative, Kirill Dmitriev, have been developing some kind of framework agreement consisting of 28 points without involving Ukraine, Europe, or even the US Congress in this plan. So it's absolutely logical to assume that since this agreement was developed by Russia and the US, the interests of Russia and the US are taken into account in it. When the document was ready, it was handed over. This is according to American media reports. It was handed over through Umerov for Ukraine to review, with a strong recommendation to accept it. So that the Ukrainian side wouldn't have too many doubts, an unusual delegation was sent here to us to persuade them, headed by the Secretary of the Army, Dan. Driscoll, along with several other high-ranking American generals, also came. I talked about this yesterday. The delegation was essentially made up of Donald Trump's personal communicators, consisting of top Pentagon officials. Trump decided to bypass, or, circumvent traditional diplomacy and brought in personal envoys. Let me remind you, Mr. Driscoll has no connection whatsoever to the State Department or to foreign policy in terms of his official duties. And also, Mr. Driscoll is a classmate of Vice President Vance, who was the one to recommend him. Let's move on to the plan. So what exactly is this plan? I've pieced it together bit by bit from various leaks from what was out there. There are 4 general categories: peace in Ukraine, security guarantees, security in Europe, and the future relations between the US and Russia and the US and Ukraine. The key points include Russia surrendering the entire Donetsk region. Ukraine must independently withdraw from all the territory of the Donetsk region that Russia has been unable to capture since 2014. The part of the Donetsk region from which the armed forces withdraw is supposed to become a demilitarized zone. That's how it's laid out. But how will it actually turn out? Will the Russians retreat further and dig in at the borders of the Donetsk region as they usually do? It's hard to say. So basically, we just have to take the Russians at their word, it turns out. Recognition by the United States of Crimea and Donbas as Russian. Here, in general, nothing is clear at all about how this mechanism is supposed to work. Legally, within the framework of international law, well, it's just not possible. No one will recognize it anyway. A normal civilized world will never recognize the occupied territories as Russian. I would just like to remind you that, legally, the annexation of Crimea has not been recognized by anyone in the world except Russia. There were statements like from Assad when he was in Syria, from Kim Jong-un as well, but formally on paper, no one has recognized it. So how does this work? Russia promises to freeze the front line in the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions. And they also demand that Ukraine's armed forces be reduced by half. This, I think, is one of the key points. And let's add to this, I'll tell you more about this point in detail in a moment. Let's also add the renunciation of key types of weaponry. Missiles, whatever else they list. Long-range weapons. Basically just give them up, in other words, so that nothing can reach Russia. Well, at least far enough away towards Moscow. So the point about reducing the size of the armed forces is only requested in 2 cases. First, if you're afraid of being attacked, in other words, if you're afraid that the Ukrainian army will attack you. Let me remind you, Russia is a nuclear state, and in the event of an attack by a non-nuclear state like Ukraine, they have every right to strike us with nuclear weapons. But if Ukraine attacks Russia, then accordingly there will be no sanctions against Russia because we would be the ones attacked first. So in this case, I think Russians really have nothing to worry about. In that case, they have every right to use nuclear weapons, as they say, against decision-making centers. That's the first scenario. If you're afraid, then you ask to reduce the size of the army. And the second scenario is when you ask to reduce the size of the army. If you yourself want to attack after some time, you need to weaken your opponent, but you realize that with such an army, you won't be able to defeat Ukraine. You need to reduce it by at least half, because once you've already taken a serious beating in Ukraine, that's why you need to cut it down and also deprive them of their weapons. Take a wild guess. Which scenario applies to the Russian Federation in this case? Why do they want to reduce our armed forces? And of course, among other things, the plan includes one more point: halting US military aid to Ukraine. Naturally, that includes intelligence and everything else. Everything comes to a stop. The plan also mentions recognizing Russian as an official state language in Ukraine, granting official status to the UOCMP, which is a branch of the Russian Orthodox Church, or for those who prefer, a branch of the FSB. You can call it either way. And new details that have started to emerge. Russia is supposedly going to return part of the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions that they occupied on the condition of negotiations. Russia will never give anything back unless it is taken from them by force. I think that's perfectly clear. Russia returning anything is just a bedtime story. How could the US and other countries possibly recognize Crimea and Donbas as Russian? I just don't understand. But they won't pressure Ukraine into recognizing it. Oh, well, yes, thank you. So there is information that Qatar and Turkey in particular are involved in developing the new plan. And Qatar participated in negotiations between Steve Witkoff and Rustem Umerov. This is actually a very interesting story. An Axios source claims that during negotiations with Umerov, many agreements were reached. Which ones, where, and how, we haven't been told yet. And basically, this plan was developed specifically for Russia. These are all the Russian demands that they could squeeze in at this moment. So that's exactly what they did. They squeezed them in. Where here? Are Ukraine's interests taken into account? It's unclear. And there's another point, an obligation for Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to accept these conditions. I think that was Putin's way of sending a message. You'll have to accept it anyway, I've won anyway. There was a movie called Escape from the Gulag. Both Western and Russian actors starred in it. And so I don't remember exactly right now. Anyway, they keep running for a long time from the Gulag. A group of people is escaping. In the end, one of them actually crosses the border, leaving Russia. And then this villain, who is the Gulag guard, the warden of the prison, he follows him all the way there, not giving up. He meets him on the bridge, standing in his way, and says with a sense of triumph, "I beat you." So this is very much like Putin, who, even after losing the war, still feels the need to make his point, to assert his dominance, and to show everyone that he is still in control. And Utikov postponed the meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky in Turkey. They were supposed to meet, since it became clear that Ukraine is not interested in discussing this Russian plan for a settlement. Axios also reports that Zelensky arrived in Ankara with a different plan developed together with European partners, which, according to sources, Russia will never accept. And Zelensky wanted the plan to be discussed in a broader format, not just quickly signing some kind of agreement. Sign it, come on, quickly, don't look. It didn't work out, as it turns out. Here's another piece of not so good news for us. All of this fits right into the story that traditional diplomacy, the State Department, is being replaced by some shady go-betweens. Well, let's put it this way, that wasn't the right way to say it. It's being replaced by some kind of backroom deals, which bypass traditional diplomacy. Even Congress wasn't informed. I'll talk about this news now. So, not very good news for Ukraine. Mr. Kellogg is leaving his post as Trump's special envoy to Ukraine in January. Reuters writes that the decision is supposedly due to frustration over being overloaded and the belief that some administration officials are not acting decisively enough to put pressure on Russia. Not decisive enough. I'll say even more. Not only has Russia started acting quite decisively here, even though it's not really in a position to do so, And here's this news about Congress, that the US Congress didn't know about the new peace plan for Ukraine. The members of Congress knew nothing about it. Lindsey Graham stated this, the Republican senator and party colleague of Donald Trump, who is a co-author of the law on these tough 500 sanctions, now tariff duties. And he says that they weren't aware of it at all. He also added that no plan will work without significant US military support for Ukraine and measures that hit Russia's ability to finance the war. Well, how can you develop these shady schemes in a corner with Dmitriev? And Trump approved a peace plan for Ukraine consisting of 28 points. I don't think he said directly, bring it over and we'll see if it's accepted or not. We'll see. That is, we've already seen more than one such plan, and none of them have been accepted. Why this plan doesn't include the key point of a ceasefire, which, by the way, was demanded by Donald Trump, I don't know. In other words, there's nothing in it that the United States demanded. There's nothing from the Ukrainian side. Everything is only from the Russian Federation side. Well, now, a few important questions. If Donald Trump decided to impose sanctions against Lukoil and Rosneft, in other words, to act from a position of strength, how did it happen that at the same time, after all, this plan had been in development for several weeks, Dmitriev and Witkoff started working on a plan that was completely advantageous for Russia? How did that happen? Let me remind you, Donald Trump himself said that Witkoff flew to meet with Putin. Putin, having no idea what Russia was or who Putin was, then there was a major diplomatic failure for which Witkoff was to blame. As it turned out, he misunderstood the Russian side. In their excitement, they organized a summit in Anchorage, Alaska, but it ended in nothing because they misunderstood Putin and failed to clarify the most important details. After this, Mr. Witkoff was not only not removed, he was actually brought in to help develop this secret plan together with perhaps one of the most cunning and professional negotiators from Russia, Kirill Dmitriev. Recently, there was a conversation between Marco Rubio and the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, where Rubio made it clear that Russia was not ready to make any concessions. And he conveyed this to Donald Trump. It turns out that at this time, work was already in full swing. This was the development of that very plan. I think that Rubio was not in the loop either, although it's nonsense to assume that the head of the State Department wasn't involved in the development of this plan. But in this configuration, anything is possible. By the way, Rubio has already made a statement saying something like, yes, he put it very vaguely, like, take a look at that plan and so on. And here's literally today's clarification that this plan provides for amnesty for war crimes in Ukraine and Russia's return to the global economy, meaning the lifting of sanctions. In other words, just everything we want. It's also simple. Let's put it as simply as possible. By the way, this is Putin's personal demand, the removal of guilt and amnesty for war crimes. He wants to keep traveling the world freely. He wants the International Criminal Court warrant against him to be lifted. He wants all the accusations that he stole Ukrainian children to be dropped. That's what he wants. Let's try to sum it up as simply as possible in one sentence. What does Russia want? Give us what we haven't been able to conquer for almost 12 years. And recognize what we've already stolen from you. Return our FSB agents in Kazakhs back to Ukraine. We still need to destabilize you from the inside. Cut your army in half, give up your weapons. We can't defeat you with such an army. And also, to fight against us and possibly the Baltic countries, we need money, a lot of money. We've spent a lot on this war. So lift the sanctions. And yes, I, Putin, don't want the burden of hundreds of thousands killed to weigh on me. Drop all the charges. Grant amnesty not just to me, but to all the murderers from Bucha, from Irpin, from all over Ukraine who were here and committed war crimes. Drop the charges against them immediately. In return, Russia will give Ukraine some kind of security guarantees on paper. You know what? Let's just write it on the back of the Budapest Memorandum, right? Well, so we don't waste extra paper. So basically, it's an analog of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Putin's full list of demands. So after this Witkoff-Dmitriev Pact and these attempts at appeasement, no one knows whether things will spiral out of control or not. After the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, when the Sudetenland was handed over to Hitler, just annexed. Nothing else will happen after that, right? Everyone remembers how that ended. And let me remind you, the modern-day Hitler, this bald guy, he also has nuclear weapons. And there's another point that I think is important. Suddenly, a lot of leaks of this agreement appeared. You could practically piece together all 28 points if you tried. Why are there so many leaks? It's supposed to be a secret agreement, after all. Most likely, this is connected to the fact, that there was an existential conflict in the US between classic diplomacy, including the State Department and Congress. And they were a bit shocked that not very, to put it mildly, professional people were secretly, behind closed doors, preparing documents of such complexity and importance. And it seems to me that they decided, let's just sink this document right now, leak it completely, before it even gets to Ukraine. Well, I also wanted to take a moment to say something important about General Kellogg. Donald Trump should always remember that Putin, who was once seen as a formidable leader, eventually became what many would call a paper tiger. He went from being considered a good guy to being regarded as a paper tiger. And his true nature, his real character, was ultimately revealed, or rather, perhaps not just a paper tiger, but more accurately described as a paper rat. This transformation only happened after General Kellogg convinced President Trump to get involved. A real policy of toughness and ultimatums against Putin. Kellogg is the one who needs to be kept. My respect goes to General Kellogg and, by the way, to his daughter, who heads a foundation that helps Ukraine. She often visits here and writes very insightful things while being here. Well, let's see what comes out of this agreement. There will be a meeting today. Maybe it's already happening between the Ukrainian leadership and the American delegation. Let's see how it ends. I think that no one is going to accept this nonsense in its current form. And friends, let me remind you that despite some backroom deals, and we'll get to why they're happening, who is promising what to whom, and so on. So, despite all this, Ukraine is holding on and standing up to this horde of ghouls from the swamps who came to conquer Ukrainian land. And I ask you to support our fundraiser, which is going towards nighttime Mavic drones for the 32nd Steel Separate Mechanized Brigade. They're currently fighting in the Pokrovsk direction, which, according to Putin, he supposedly encircled a month ago. But the Russians are getting hit there so hard, they don't know what hit them. And so our heroes recorded an address from the commander of the 32nd Separate Mechanized Brigade. Please take a look, and believe me, the commander there is pure steel.
Бажаємо здоров'я! Я командир батареї американських систем М109 Паладин 32-ї окремої механізованої сталевої бригади, яка зараз знаходиться на Покровському напрямку. Ми разом із глядачами каналу Бориса Тізенгаузена збираємо на комплекси Mavic 3T та Mavic 3 Pro та антени з репітерами до них. Ми дуже дякуємо глядачам каналу, які допомагають нам та не забувають, що війна триває. Дякуємо вам. Слава Україні!
Героям слава!
Let's help our defenders. Right now, they need our help more than ever. The link to the fundraiser is in the description of this video. There you'll also find Mono, Private, and PayPal for those who want to help from abroad. And to each of you, I always say a huge thank you, a sincere thank you from myself and from our defenders. Well, a small digression. I occasionally keep in touch with those we've helped. They write to me, I write to them. How are you? We send things to each other from time to time. And recently, our UAV operators wrote to me, the ones we got a pickup truck and a repeater for after raising funds. They say, here it is, running, working. Every time, with kind and warm words, they remember the viewers of this channel. A huge thank you to you, my friends. And the medics too. In short, there are so many kind and warm words for you for those who help Ukraine. We've talked about good people, and unfortunately once again about the ghouls. Such are the times we live in. And now, a bit about that church Putin is trying to bring back to Ukraine, or more precisely about the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill. Patriarch Kirill stated that Russians fighting in Ukraine are not violating the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." He noted that those who rise to defend the fatherland, protecting the lives of the weak and defenseless, are on the contrary fulfilling God's commandments. We do not have the right to sacrifice our neighbors or expose our compatriots to danger, this ghoul triarch emphasized. What homeland were they defending when they drove tanks to the border with Ukraine? What homeland were they protecting here near Kiev, in Bucha, near Chernihiv, in Kherson? Whose homeland were they defending? This patriarch Kirill is a deceitful, disgusting devil.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
By the way, even Russians themselves don't like him because of his yachts, villas, and love of luxury. This to me just seems like a concentrated ball of vileness. By the way, the whole world is now watching the operation to save Putin's image. It seems to me that with these measures, they're trying to somehow save Putin's Botoxed mask. Well, really. He's really dug himself in up to his ears here. And just imagine for a second if Donald Trump, instead of 28 points, had approved the transfer of Tomahawk missiles to Kiev. And within a week, Putin would be left without a single port to ship oil from. I guess I'm daydreaming again. Here's a purely Russian news story. I just couldn't pass it by. A high-ranking Russian military officer was reportedly poisoned with beer in Donbas with a military-grade toxic agent. This was reported by the FSB's Public Relations Center. So remember, a Russian soldier will never pick up a random unfamiliar object. Unless, of course, it's alcohol. So the approach was absolutely correct. When the Russians entered Ukraine, there were dozens, if not hundreds, of cases where hospitable Ukrainians brought them. They thought, look at how we're being welcomed here, while they had been told that people here would be throwing Molotov cocktails from around the corner, shooting and so on. But that was the last meal the Russians ever tasted in this life. So, yes, it happened, it really did, and in this case they tried again. I think they did manage to poison them, but the FSB guys decided not to lose face. By the way, yes, alcohol is their weak spot. I think that no matter what position Medvedev holds, if you just toss him a can of beer, he'll jump for it right off the balcony. So I was leading up to what all of this is actually connected to. Why Witkoff? Why Dmitriev? Why are they somehow bypassing everything, bypassing diplomacy, the State Department? Why is this happening now? Even Congress is probably looking at this with eyes wide open. Our segment, Just Business. Well, maybe it's because Dmitriev... You know, Dmitriev is like a well-known character from a movie who always has something to offer hidden in the lining of his jacket, here and here. One moment he's offering Elon Musk money to colonize Mars, then he's proposing a tunnel between Russia and Alaska, named after Trump and Putin. I think he'll always have something to offer. He's got both the stick and the carrot and a dossier on whoever he needs. And so I come across an interesting piece of news in this context. Lukoil's oil empire will be divided between Arab sheikhs and American energy giants. Lukoil's foreign assets that have come under sanctions, which include oil fields, refineries, and gas stations in 11 countries, may be sold off in parts. Bloomberg reports, citing its sources, that the largest American energy giants and the state oil company of the United Arab Emirates are interested. That's how things can turn out. And in Germany, there is a lot of concern about rumors that American investors might acquire, or at least have their eye on, the Nord Stream pipelines. They've even developed a corresponding law in Germany to make sure that no one touches those pipelines. And Reuters reported that Steve Witkoff discussed the sale of the Nord Stream pipelines with the Russian side, while Independent and Politico wrote that Mr. Witkoff lobbied for the lifting of energy sanctions on Russia. I don't know how to piece this whole puzzle together in my head. Maybe you, my little viewers, can help us. How can we do that? How can we put all of this together into one puzzle? A puzzle? And here's another interesting option presented by The Telegraph. In the peace plan for Ukraine proposed by the US, it is stated that Russia could pay Kyiv rent for its de facto control over Donbas. The Telegraph reports this, citing its own sources. Well, money for land, as they say. So the point could be that legally Donbas remains part of Ukraine, but Russia pays some kind of rent for it. No, they've already included it as their own. That is legally for Russia. It's already written into their constitution, just like Zaporizhzhia, Kherson regions, and Crimea. It's not entirely clear what kind of money they would be paying Ukraine for Donbas. So I have a question for the Russians. Isn't your own 17 million square kilometers of land enough for you? So you need to pay for someone else's land too, for land that's been burned. It's really quite astonishing. When Russians say save Donbas, may save the people of Donbas, what does it mean for a normal person to save people from a territory where they're supposedly suffering? Does it mean to just burn that territory to the ground along with the people, drive half of them to slaughter, or what? Or take them to your place, to your 17 million square kilometers, where they'll be comfortable, where all the traditional values are ready for them, and they'll live there happily. What does it mean to save them? When you see people being rescued from some island in a movie, do they burn them out with a flamethrower along with the island, or what? I don't understand. Ah, right, sorry. I'm trying to apply logic to Putin's Russia. That's my mistake. Sorry, I won't do it again. And now the State Duma has promised to completely replace YouTube for Russians. Once again, they just won't give up, will they? Of course, they've tried twice to launch alternative services. One was called Platforma, there was another one, I don't remember the name. Both of them failed. But that's okay. The Russian YouTube consists of Shaman's music videos and Putin's speeches. Then, of course, Dolina has to be there, telling everyone how they should live. And some other unpleasant faces like Matvienko. And someone else, and that robot, the one who... cartoons about Poseidon, Sarmat, and Burevestnik and all the rest, that's what Russian YouTube will be. It's interesting, will they watch it on Russian smartphones or will they keep watching on iPhones? That's a good question, because in the State Duma, where the biggest patriots sit, they were the first ones, judging by the footage I've seen, to buy themselves the latest iPhone models. That's not good. And will they switch to Russian Moskvich cars? Somehow it doesn't seem very patriotic. By the way, friends, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Judging by the constant invasion of Russian bot armies, we're definitely doing everything right here. Just imagine, Medvedev, I'm picturing Medvedev, finds this channel on YouTube. After all, it's not blocked on his latest iPhone. He finds it and watches under a fake username. And he yells in the comments, "I'm not an alcoholic, Tizengauzen. Stop calling me that. I'm not a half-liquid Terminator. You're all lying." So subscribe, friends. Let more people know the truth. And now a little more about the greatness of the Russian Federation. Remember, when the Russians were retreating from the Kiev region, they stole everything they could rip out and carry from Ukrainian homes and apartments. There are dozens of hours of recordings from post offices in Belarus where the Russians were withdrawing through Belarus, through the Chernobyl forest to there. So, as it happened, they showed up there in person and then proceeded to send the loot which they had obtained from those post offices to various different corners and regions of the Russian Federation. Those phone conversations that were recorded are honestly so disgusting, absolutely revolting, and they are just full of swearing, cursing, and all sorts of foul language. And then, in the middle of all that, he tells his lady, like, "I'm bringing you some rings and you'll try on the fur coat, maybe it'll fit. I stole it from an apartment, from the Ukrainians." Can you imagine this madness came to us? And this works on a state level too. What does it mean to want someone else's land? Give us, hand over Donbas. Give us that piece of your land which is internationally recognized. They're thieves, the state is a thief. They steal grain from the occupied territories. Why look any further? Remember Putin's famous quote where he talked about American technologies and said, "Why should we develop our own extraction technologies? We'll just wait until the Americans invest a bunch of money into these technologies, develop them, and then, as he said, snatch them up, like a fish-eyed thug, snatch them up." And now they've decided to legally cement this status of a thief state. In other words, the State Duma has passed a law on the confiscation of housing of Ukrainians in the occupied territories. That is, these Ukrainians who didn't want to live under occupation left. Now their apartments are being declared ownerless, and they're going to either sell them off somewhere or just take them for themselves. A thief state. But no matter how long the rope twists, it will come to an end eventually. And now some economic news that maybe Putin isn't even being told about, because he's always going on about how the dollar is collapsing, how we're going to defeat everyone. For the first time, Russia has started selling off its gold reserves to fill Putin's military budget. For the first time, the Bank of Russia has begun actual sales of physical gold from its reserves as part of a finance ministry operation. Up until recently, these operations were virtual. In other words, the government was selling gold not on the market, but to the central bank. So, in effect, they were just moving the gold reserves from one pocket to another. But now, the situation has changed. They've started carrying out real transactions to sell physical gold. So that's how it is. Everything is going according to plan. Judging by the mounting problems in the economy and the lack of significant results on the front, things are clearly not going as the Kremlin had expected. Add to this the willingness of European countries to help Ukraine with long-term programs. And it becomes clear why the operation to save Putin's Botox mask is accelerating. Essentially, with such forecasts, the only thing left is a final attempt to force Ukraine to accept the terms this coming winter. In other words, the attempt to deprive Ukraine of light and heat this winter, until spring, that's the window he has left, and to use it in negotiations. And finally, when Donald Trump says, "I ended 8 wars," here's some unsolicited advice if we ever have such a segment, if you really push this. If you finish off that bald jellyfish from the Kremlin, then you can boldly say you ended 18 or even 19 wars. In that case, Donald Trump would definitely get the Nobel Prize. Why 19? Because if you take him down now, at the very least, the world won't see another dozen wars he could start. So that's an instant Nobel for Donald, and I'd be the first to raise my hand in support of awarding him that Nobel Prize. And you, friends, take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones, and subscribe to this channel. Let's help our defenders. The link to donate is in the description of this video. Wishing us all a peaceful day, and glory to Ukraine!